For us as a human race to evolve and learn, we have to constantly assess objectively and honestly our history, and especially the history of war, making a note that the first casualty of war is usually the truth. Thus, it is for us historians to clean up these lies, misconceptions, and the years of propaganda after the wars ended. Something often an unwelcome task. But in the hopes of a better understanding of events and of people, it has to be done. Maybe our politicians could learn something and repeat fewer of the same mistakes. The Second World War still holds much of this to be corrected, and as more documentation surfaces, we can begin to honestly do this, even if we had suspicions before. Documents are nice to have. Now, based on new information and analysis of what is in plain information to all, I would like to try to clarify one of these grand illusions of that war. When doing so with an open mind, it really highlights that there could have been other outcomes of the war, even still involving defeating Germany, of course, but with a better world than the one we had after. Had better choices been made. So who made these decisions and why? In my previous episode, I went over much of the practical information of what material was made and built and how the Russians had learned key lessons and refined their production pending their invasion west. Because by now there's an overwhelming amount of documentation, and the hardware produced and moved to the demarcation line shows a clear intent for Stalin to attack Germany and her allies in July 1941. Hitler simply pressed ahead and jumped off first. Ready or not, he seemingly had little choice. But that's not the most important part of the missing narrative and the lost history of the Second World War. There's worse to come than Stalin's planned war, especially when we remember why Britain and France entered the war, in order to preserve and defend the sovereignty of one sole independent nation. So how did we end up winning the war, and yet giving up multiple independent nations in both West and East and Far East to the control of just another dictator? FDR was often said to be a visionary and being far-sighted, meaning he should have seen what would happen if one feeds a dictatorship all the means of war and oppression it would need. Both he, White, Hopkins saw Russia as the emerging great power, but they are the ones who made that happen. So either FDR was gullible, an idiot, or naive as to Stalin the communist dictator, or he was a supporter of Soviet communism. Or both. Nothing about this makes FDR look very good historically, even if you're squinting a little. In November 1940, when Molotov went to Berlin, he and Stalin wanted too much. They pushed too hard. They demanded Bulgaria and for Hitler to also hand over Romania and oil fields, and still more. Hitler, who had seen how Stalin negotiates and how it went for Finland, was unmoved, and the negotiations broke down that winter. Despite continuing trade and talks, it had become clear that Stalin was going to try to get his way one way or another, and Hitler made his decision that he would have to prepare for war with Russia. Something which probably had been on his mind before, but now it had to be sped up. And at that point, did Stalin begin to narrow down the date for his attack on the West. He had stated a decade before, already in 1928, that this would happen one day. It was inevitable. Initially, since the revolution, it was the intent of the communist leadership to spread communism to the West, first by instigating the workers of the world to rise up and overthrow their governments, as they had tried in Germany in 1918 and again later. The workers in the industrialized Western nations, however, did not seem interested in a communist paradise and resisted. The Soviets had then tried to take over Poland militarily, but was simply not strong enough and lost. So now, years later, having realized this, Stalin shifted the entire weight of Russia, his society, to one of armament productions and military growth. Foodstuffs, gold, anything which could be traded with the West was, in return for know-how. For tanks was purchased, technology was obtained. Americans and Germans set up factories in Russia. Patents were stolen or bought by Russian spies. And relationships were built and created within FDR's administration, whom slowly but steadily would evict anybody in their administration who stood against Stalin, replacing all important positions with pro-Soviet people. The starvation in Ukraine in 1932-33, where millions were starved to death for their grain and seed grain, which was then partially distributed to the industrial centers of Russia so the workers building tanks and planes could eat, but also traded to the West for materials. Millions were imprisoned in Stalin's gulags to build great construction projects, industry, roads, and rails were laid throughout. They dug mines in horrible conditions to extract gold and other precious metals, all again sold and traded to the U.S. for know-how and factories. Stalin had a plan to force industrialization on Russia and surpass the West, and fast. Russians died in the millions, were killed, starved, imprisoned, forced to relocate, all towards this end. This was the communist people's paradise, but the people did not matter. After the Russian Revolution, the Russians had nationalized all banks and businesses, defaulting on all foreign loans, and left a lot of Western banks and businessmen out millions of dollars in investments and loans, including the U.S. government loans. Across Europe, millions of people were out savings and investments, which simply went away when the communists took over. That brought another problem for the revolutionaries, that when you confiscate everything and default on all loans, nobody will lend you any more. And having promised the peasants a piece of land of their own, that was great for the revolutionary cause. But then, afterwards, when you let them work their own land, yet confiscate everything that grows, they stop growing. Russia was now extremely poor. The world revolution did not seem forthcoming. And Stalin desperately wanted to open trade with the West and with Americans. Russians were selling everything, national antiques, Bibles, and gold, at their low point. But eventually Soviet leaders relented some of their policies, and this reversed the harvest at least. But they still had no access to the international financial markets. Something FDR had to remedy in order to get Congress to open up trade with the Russians. A country not even recognized until 1933, when they finally opened an embassy in America. Remembering there were many sympathizers in America, both in the FDR administration, the State Department, but also in the media. People like journalist Walter Durantes, the New York Times bureau chief in Russia during the Holodomor, the early 1930s, deliberate starvations of millions of Ukrainians. He whitewashed it, claimed it never happened, entirely lied about it. It did not happen. Communist sympathizers were everywhere. In fact, the international media downplayed that entire episode, just like Stalin's gulags or his murder of dissidents and any other opponents. It was never really mentioned by the left-leaning media. But there had always been communist sympathizers in certain circles in the U.S. and elsewhere. How else would Trotsky have been allowed out of New York during World War I to set up the revolution in Russia? People like Harry Hopkins, FDR's closest aide and Lend-Lease administrator, must be singled out for his pro-Soviet stance, approving massive aid without oversight. Hopkins' actions borders on treason. Other figures, like Harry Dexter White, the Treasury Department, have been identified as Soviet agents or sympathizers. They manipulated U.S. policy. They restricted exports to Japan to provoke that war, something which was benefiting Stalin. Soviet agents had infiltrated U.S. key agencies, including the State Department, the OSS as well. All this was enabled by FDR's 1933 recognition of the Soviet Union, which destigmatized communism and laxed security somewhat. These agents provided Stalin with intelligence and influenced policy, such as prioritizing Soviet aid over U.S. military needs from right after Barbarossa began. For the first 5 months, FDR's administration kept it secret that they were aiding the Red Army due to the Neutrality Act, something Roosevelt desperately wanted to circumvent, as there was great opposition in the U.S. to helping the Russians especially. Even diplomats were told to keep this a secret and not talk about it. The singular focus of the entire Soviet nation was up-armament, with the intent to conquer other nations and spread communism. Pure and simple. And Stalin knew that since the Western industrialized countries could harness industry against him, as well as the workers apparently, he would have to destroy them first, or have them destroy each other. So before conquest, Stalin would have to weaken his opponents. And if he could be setting the Germans, the French, the Brits, Japanese, and Americans against one another in a war, that would be the way to weaken them. So he could finally roll them up with an enormous, fast-moving tank force and impose communism on them the hard way. And to a large extent, that is exactly what ended up happening. Although Stalin knew he did not want to turn Britain and the U.S. against him in an outright war, despite both nations being highly critical of communism and he did not trust them, he still managed to end up receiving their full support, not just in words, but in billions of dollars worth of war material, cash, food, trucks, planes, tanks, the value of which the Russians have of course since downplayed the importance of, but it is highly unlikely Russia could have sustained the war without the masses of supplies from America and Britain. The Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Pact of August 23, 1939 was a deliberate move by Stalin to provoke war in Europe. The pact's secret protocols allowed Stalin to annex eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina, eliminating buffer zones and positioning Soviet forces for a future offensive. If Stalin had truly been worried about Hitler and a German attack, a Poland between them would be optimal. He chose to eliminate this, suggesting to Hitler they simply share that country. That would move them into a better striking position, of course. That worked both ways. Stalin supplied Germany with critical resources, million tons of oil, 1.6 million tons of grain, 140,000 tons of manganese, just in 1940 alone, enabling Hitler's invasion, while Stalin was expecting Germany to exhaust itself against Britain and France. That was the plan. He fueled the German war machine to make that possible. Germany lacked many of the raw materials needed, so if Stalin wanted to hinder the war, he could simply have denied Hitler these. But he did not. He was quite content that Hitler would not attack as he needed these resources. So despite feeling safe, Stalin still mobilized over 5 million soldiers in September 1939 for a 2-year period. Stalin was preparing for his attack west in 1941, after the Allies and Germany had bloodied one another. So naturally it did not suit Stalin that the French and Brits did not attack Germany after the Battle of Poland. This was his hope at least, and it was a negative surprise for him as well that Germany defeated the Allies and France as fast as they did, with the low casualty numbers all round. These events also had some effect on his military plans and possibly pushed them backwards somewhat, as he wanted more medium and heavy tanks produced before jumping off. Germany's invasion of Poland was seen internationally as a criminal act, yet the Russian invasion of Poland, and later of Finland, was seemingly forgotten. Russia were, however, expelled by the League of Nations, and even FDR was denouncing the Russians for this, even to some extent banning certain exports. This was then a growing story in the news. It was, of course, later whitewashed at Nuremberg, and even since, to be generally downplayed and forgotten. But the British was preparing a military strike on Russian oil fields, transferring 4 squadrons of Blenheims to northern Iraq from where they could reach them. Reconnaissance flights and bomb determinations in coordination with the French had taken place, and Stalin was aware and concerned. He did not need a war with the Allies now, So he had to balance his international diplomacy with his immediate Finnish conquest. It was not going as fast as expected, and the Western pressure was mounting. So compelled by the great losses in Finland, which slowed down the Russian progress, Stalin forced the Finnish to a peace deal, without getting everything he wanted. He did get most of it, but having called up millions of soldiers to throw into battle, he could have continued, and the Finnish was on the brink. But he needed peace now, before the Allies gave in to their public's pressure to act. The lack of actual help and assistance certainly nudged the Finns to join with Hitler in his attack on Russia. But in an interesting event, both Germany, France, and England, America, had helped the Finns with military aid to some degree. Britain sent some planes, as did the Americans, weapons, rifles, and Germany would send a significant amount of weapons, tanks, planes later, including American and French planes captured in France the following year. There appeared little interest amongst the Allies in Stalin's invasion of 6 countries prior: Poland, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, and even parts of China, if you want to count that all, in between 1939 and 41, matching Germany's aggression in scope. These moves reflect Stalin's imperialist ambitions. And if one includes the Katyn massacre of 30,000 Polish officers killed in 1940, something everybody in the Allied camps suspected. And when the Germans found the graves and the bodies and shared this information with International Red Cross and the Poles alike, Churchill and FDR knew. They both knew that Stalin had done it, but they remained silent. Certainly this was a snapshot of who Stalin was, and an indication to the Allies of what might happen if Stalin's communists took over half of Europe. Stalin's mindset was evident, and his plans were obviously known within the top Soviet leadership. So Zhukov presented Stalin with a plan of first strike. The Soviet military plan, dated May 15, 1941, proposed a preemptive attack on German forces to deprive the German command of all initiative and strike when it was still in the deployment stage. And in 1941, the Red Army's forward deployments had 5 million troops, some 23,000 tanks, and 69,000 artillery pieces concentrated along that border, often in offensive salients, vulnerable to encirclement, as an army would be in their staging areas. But Hitler knew, and beat him to it, just by a few weeks. Now, historians and documentaries since have claimed that upon Barbarossa Stalin had hid away, but he was at the Stavka in the days after Barbarossa, so the rumors which persisted ever since that he hid in the Stjatsa for weeks are completely false. The documents from the Russian archives bear this out. The Politburo passed a lot of resolutions those days, and Stalin signed them in those days as well. Now, interestingly enough, after Stalin died, the new Soviet leadership collectively found it productive to blame him for being unprepared, as well as they fueled the notion that their army was unprepared and obsolete. This was born out of the face-saving fact that how else could it be explained to the Russian people that they were so heavily mauled by the German military? How can you explain getting beat well, while at the same time of having the greatest military in the greatest communist country? You tell everybody that everything was obsolete and Stalin failed. But the Soviets had tanks with bigger guns, heavier armor, and more powerful engines than anybody in the world, so how could it be obsolete? They had 1,000 heavy tanks, the Germans had none. They had 23,000 tanks versus Germans' 3,500. And for the Soviets to simply admit that they were caught not ready after 10 years of preparation for war was just as hard as to say as to admit Germany's military commander and tactics strategy was simply better, at least initially. And the Russians did fight back hard in many cases after Barbarossa. But the Germans had destroyed much of their initial logistics and communications, making it hard for the Soviets' command to mount effective counterattacks. Coordination was near impossible, with communications having been disrupted. The Stavka had a hard time gaining an overview and issued orders impossible to carry out by the time they were arrived. And smaller local units, commanders, did counterattack. Some smaller counterstrokes were quite effective, and the heavy KV tanks and the T-34s but fed into the German front piecemeal, they were destroyed by localized, overwhelming firepower, or in some cases by Germans leveling their artillery guns, firing point blank at them. So despite the Russians' overwhelming superiority in everything, they could not mount a deliberate, coordinated counterattack, and that is why the German army had such an initial success. The Russian army and air force were prepared for their own attack. They were still several weeks away from being ready for their own coordinated attack. Fuel, munitions were still in assembly areas, on train carts. The tankers were still training and learning their small unit tactics for attack. Few tanks had radios. Some tank units were actively holding maneuvers on June 22nd. The airfields had not been camouflaged yet. Buildings had not been completed yet. They were building roads west. The Russians were not building bunkers anymore. But why would they be at all? The intention was never to remain where they were, but to move forward. That is why so many supply trains were still full. So much fuel and ammunition were still on trucks, not dispersed to the troops. They were expecting to follow their armored spearhead west. Some of the southern Russian sectors had been further along in their preparations, given the Molotov and Stalin line, and had better communication networks, and presented German army groups south with hard resistance, sometimes even staging local successful counterattacks. But with southern sectors' flank being exposed as Army Group Center pushed forward hard, they had no choice but to pull back. They were caught with their pants down, not something a communist dictatorship is prone to admit to. Consider a contemporary situation. In the Israeli attack on Iran in 2025, where all Iranian air defenses were destroyed. The skies were owned by Israeli and U.S. planes. Yet, when the U.S. president called a halt to the hostilities, the Iranians went to their public and declared victory. Only in a dictatorial state, where you own the media, can you get away with something like that. Remember Baghdad Bob back when. The closed-off communist Soviet Union did the same ever since the Second World War, and many Westerners for a long time went along with that narrative as nobody had access to the Russian files, something still hard to research today. East and West today cannot even agree when World War II started. Maybe somebody should ask the Poles or Chinese that question. Before the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, U.S. neutrality laws, established in 1935, prohibited direct arms sales to belligerents. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, FDR secured a revision for cash and carry sales, allowing allies like Britain and France to buy arms with cash and transport them themselves. The Soviet Union, initially a German ally, via the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was ineligible. After Germany's invasion of the USSR, both FDR and Churchill saw an opportunity, if not a need, to ally with the Russians and fight jointly. But in July 1940 already, FDR had begun diplomatic efforts to improve the U.S.-Russian relations, lifting a trade embargo in January 1941, despite Russia's aggression in Poland and Finland and the satellite states and the alliance with Hitler. FDR introduced Lend-Lease in December of 1940, using the garden hose analogy to sell it as a non-war measure, lending supplies to allies like Britain to fight Germany, keeping U.S. troops out, of course. The act faced fierce opposition from senators like Charles Tobey and Robert Taft, who feared it gave FDR unchecked power and risked war. Many senators proposed excluding Russia due to its pact with Germany and their anti-communist sentiments. FDR's allies, including Secretary of War Henry Stinson, argued that allies needed to be aided, including potentially Russia, post-Barbarossa, as it was cheaper than direct U.S. involvement. FDR ensured the act's language was broad, avoiding specific exclusions, allowing future Soviet inclusions. FDR already supplied limited numbers of aid to Russia from before December 41 via the cash and carry and through British intermediaries. using executive authority to bypass their own strict neutrality laws, and later by linking all countries together that were receiving Lend-Lease, some 38 of them, into one large congressional bill so nobody could exclude Russia from receiving aid. What is interesting is that despite Russia being on the ropes in the latter half of 1941, with the Germans at the gates of Moscow, where Stalin and Andrei Gromyko would lecture Avril Harriman that the U.S. was not sending enough ships, Stalin would complain that the U.S. was only sending 1,000 tons armored steel for tanks, when the U.S. produced so much more. There was zero gratitude, simply an arrogant sense of entitlements and demands, at a point where the U.S. had no real reason to help the Russians in the first place. And this would continue. The FDR administration would bend over backwards to satisfy Stalin, to the detriment of their own army and air force. MacArthur was under heavy Japanese attack in the Philippines. He was under the impression that a rescue mission was forthcoming. But instead of helping him and his own forces, FDR sent Stalin 10,000 trucks, 550 tanks, 144 fighters, 133 bombers, and 10 cargo ships full of flour, sugar, and wheat, and also 20,000 tons of petroleum and 50,000 tons total. But nothing to the Pacific, and the Philippines thus fell to a brutal Japanese occupation until 1945. But not just FDR. Also Churchill, who had historically always been outspoken against the communist regime. He too had favored delivering planes and tanks to Stalin over that of his own empire. As British troops were fighting for the destiny of Singapore, Churchill decided to send the 200 Hurricanes destined there to Russia, and we all know how that went for his troops there. There was a clear Russia-first policy over that of even self-interest in some cases. The U.S. entire pork industry was revamped. 30% or more went to the Russians. Sugar, aluminum, iron, entire factories, plants, metal rollers, cranes, steel, tire plants, rubber plants, oil refineries. And the Russians would not have made it to Berlin without the 400,000 vehicles sent them by the Americans. And the Russians did enjoy the Allied tanks, although only admitting this in private. You still see them driving through the entire war, rolling into Berlin on specially made Shermans with diesel engines, because that is what the Russians wanted. The Air Cobra, at one point, the Americans produced more for the Russians than for their own Air Force, and FDR would at times reroute planes and materials for American soldiers to the Russians instead. And what did the U.S. get in return? Well, nothing, really. No intelligence, no aid. The Russians were trading gasoline to the Japanese for 4 years of the war, just like they had sold the Germans oil and steel for 2 years while they were fighting the British. Stalin had no loyalty or appreciation whatsoever for this aid. American pilots, having had to crash land on Russian territory in Manchuria, was imprisoned for the rest of the war, and at no point did FDR even mention this in order to have them released in return for aid. Nor did FDR actually ask Stalin for anything. In fact, and in 1945, the attack on Japanese forces in Manchuria by Stalin's forces, it was entirely an operation fueled, funded, and supplied by America. Despite all American commanders clearly having said that they had no need for Russia to help or intervene. Yet the aid kept flowing, giving Stalin a huge chunk of Asia for practically nothing. Stalin took huge advantage of the American aid and supplies, building up factories and infrastructure and supplies for even after the war. But without Lend-Lease, it is impossible to conceive the Russians would have been able to build up their great mechanized forces during the war, a force with which Stalin would take over huge parts of Europe, a part the Soviets would not give up until 1991. And for all of this, Russia paid, eventually, decades later, 1 or 2 cents to the dollar, without interest. One could argue that the Russians did, however, pay with blood, holding up over 80% of the German forces at any given moment of the war. However, this is Russia. We all know that lives does not matter, so it was a cheap price for Stalin. Unlike Britain, FDR's ally, Churchill would have put the country in debt for decades to come for all the aid they got. FDR charged his ally exponentially more than he did Stalin, from whom he asked practically nothing. And it could not have been a secret to either of the two men what kind of man Stalin was. The Russians' murder of 30,000 Polish officers and Stalin's eternal denials of this crime. Despite this, FDR knew, Churchill knew, both who had done this, although later they denied it, lied about it, fired press officers who tried to mention it, and at Nuremberg trials, Germans were hung for having done it. Yet everybody knew what the Soviets had done. But let's not anger Uncle Stalin. Incidentally, this was a nickname made up by a publicity company in order to make Stalin, the communist dictator, more palpable to the American public. And when the three men met in Yalta, for either one to broach the topic of what was to happen with the post-war Poland, it was a moot point, because at this point Stalin practically ran the show, having been handed the actual power by the two. FDR even managed to side with Stalin against Churchill at times. FDR, he even let Morgenthau blackmail and threaten Churchill into silence and compliance, threatening him by withholding all aid to Britain. Yet nobody ever thought to do this in order to free the imprisoned American pilots in Russia. And while American citizens were forced to eat margarine, the Russians were sent all the American butter and boots. Almost all the Soviet boot and leather production was in the Baltic region, and the Germans had seized this. The Russians could not even have shoed or clothed their soldiers without the U.S. The enormity of the Lend-Lease aid, given again something downplayed by the Russians ever since. Even Stalin was surprised by everything the Allies gave him, but he would constantly demand for more without gratitude. The Russians would not even share intelligence, nor would they even allow the Allied sailors, who had been risking their lives bringing convoys to Russia, to go freely on their ground unguarded. Nor would Stalin allow American pilots who were delivering the airplanes to the Red Air Force to actually land in Russia. These planes were picked up by Russian pilots in America. Fairbanks, Alaska was practically taken over by the Russians, as American pilots would not be allowed to fly anywhere into Russia, even with planes or supplies. So Russian pilots had to come to the U.S. to retrieve these, and fly them east over Siberia. And of course, every politician stationed in Moscow was a Stalin yes-man. Those who had doubts about the reason behind this unhindered flood of American goods to a communist country was promptly removed and replaced. FDR also suggested 50 specialists could come to the Russian ports to see how they could be upgraded and improved, by Americans, of course. This was denied as well. American aircrafts and tank engineers wanted to visit the Russian front to see how their machines fared under fire and in battle, to see if improvements could be made to the upkeep of production. This too was denied. It's also important to remember the war in the East against Japan, which had started because Japan had invaded China and Korea specifically to obtain resources. And Chiang Kai-shek, who was an U.S. ally fighting against the Japanese and also against the Chinese communists, yet he obtained less than a fraction of what the Russians got. And despite the Russians having traded with the Japanese, having signed a non-aggression pact with them in 1941, still FDR negotiated with Stalin to aid the U.S. after Germany's defeat, something no longer militarily needed. FDR had passed away, but still his administration ensured that Stalin would furnish with tons and tons of material in order to facilitate his attack on the Japanese, despite objections from the American military commanders. Of course, Stalin did nothing until it was quite clear that the Japanese was beat and he had gotten all he wanted, just like he had waited as long as possible for the Germans and the Allies to have blooded each other before beginning to plan his offensive west. The Japanese had even reached out for a peace deal. This was turned down by the American president, and Stalin they had approached to broker a peace deal. He refused to hear it. And in the end, the Russians, with FDR's blessing, took over vast parts of China and Korea, some parts that are still today Russian. The U.S. ended up at war with Japan in order to protect Pacific countries the U.S. would later hand over to Stalin, just like all the Eastern European countries. So one can ask, what was the point of it all? If the president, administration, following presidents, would give away everything they had fought for to just another dictator. FDR hated the British Empire, and he treated Churchill terribly. Not that his foreign policies were pure. After all, between Chamberlain and Churchill, Britain was a great empire. But before the war, and after the war, they were a broke, indebted nation with no colonies, paying the Americans back practically ever since until a decade ago. And despite this, FDR actually proposed to Stalin that perhaps India would be a good place for a communist revolution in Soviet style in order to overthrow the British there. I mean, with friends like these. Harry Hopkins, FDR's closest advisor, would brag to reporters that everything he did and had done was to support the Soviet Union. So whether he was a spy or not does not really matter when everything he did was to further Soviet interests over Americans or their ally Britain. It has since been claimed that he was a Russian spy, but what does it matter? He served them better than he served his own country. And after all, not everybody in FDR's administration was a paid spy. Many of them were simply personal supporters of Stalin's Russia and socialism quite openly. Churchill was pushing for an operation in the Mediterranean, an invasion. It was a quick way up into Germany. However, Stalin did not want that. Couldn't chance that any of the Allies got into Germany before him, so FDR, of course, sided with Stalin and demanded Churchill conform and only focus on Normandy. And there were events, one in particular where Hopkins pressed a note to FDR as he opened to the idea of maybe it was okay with a second front to Stalin. The note said to stop because Stalin did not want it. Such might have ended the war in Europe before Stalin took everything he wanted. And it gets much, much worse. Despite other port options, Stalin demanded the materials sent by the U.S. to be sent only to Murmansk or Archangel. These ports were the closest to Britain, true, but were within reach of the German Kriegsmarine, and some Luftwaffe raids took place there against Murmansk. These were extremely dangerous convoy routes near the Arctic Circle. The weather was atrocious, and the older ports not particularly suited for high-volume deliveries. Roosevelt suggested through the Persian Gulf, but Stalin would not hear of it, or of the dangers to the Allied sailors running the convoys, who of course had to be protected by Allied warships, and as far as possible covered by Allied aircraft. And Stalin was constantly complaining that the aid he got was not enough, not considering how many ships had been sunk by the Germans or the Allied losses. This meant nothing to him or his demands. And the few cargo ships and icebreakers the Russians did possess, mostly old and worn out, well, they were all rotated through American ports and shipyards, where they were all refitted, re-equipped, degaussed, and armed at American expense, of course. Only when Japan and the U.S. was at war would Stalin allow shipments to arrive in small numbers to Vladivostok. And of course now these could be sunk by the Japanese Navy. So to make sure they were safe, Stalin had 57 American merchant vessels transferred under Russian flag, since he had a non-aggression pact with the Japanese. Before the war, Russian spies had purchased human assets and informants, and plans of war material in the U.S. This was no longer necessary. They simply just had to ask to see something they wanted. Factories, weapons, plants, planes, airplanes, and Russian agents was allowed to photograph anything they wanted. Harry Dexter White would give Stalin's people anything, and more. They just had to ask. Stalin's spies would visit weapons testing sites, and the Soviets no longer had to worry about an asking price as before the war. Now they simply pointed to what they wanted, and it would happen for free. The Foreign Ministry again was fully infiltrated by Soviet agents and staffed by Russian sympathizers. They would allow Soviet agents anywhere within the military and civilian companies. They could roam and copy anything freely, even despite the objections of those there. That included the Patent Office, where thousands of American patents were simply copied and sent to Russia, including plans of the then American nuclear program. FDR would even send them heavy water and uranium. There were no limits to the industrial-scale pillaging of American know-how, for free, with the government's blessing and active help. And interestingly enough, after Pearl Harbor, the Soviet demands only grew as the American war production was exponentially ramped up. And there certainly could be made a case that with the infiltration of the FDR circle, who advised FDR to embargo Japan, the outcome was foreseeable, and one can draw the lines of this advice back to Stalin. In December 1941, Lukashenko ordered 8.5 million high-chromium stainless steel ball bearings. Hopkins was informed by the Army engineers that current demands for bearings resulting from our own expanding tank and airplane production, our supply is critically affected already. W. L. Blatt wrote Stettinius and Hopkins, would the Soviets not consider corrosion-resistant plating rather than high-chromium steel balls? Hopkins would not hear of it. So instead of disappointing Stalin, he chose to disappoint his own military. They would get those of lesser quality, creating a serious shortage for American production for the first year of the war. The U.S. was forced to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to construct new factories in the U.S., especially to build materials specifically ordered and designed by the Russians. Stalin even demanded an entire 18-inch steel rolling mill to be built in the U.S. and shipped to Russia, something which would operate there for decades after the war, building Russian industry. And of course, along with all the Western material and machinery, Russia seized everything from territories they occupied, but that is a different story. However, was the Russians not just a little grateful for American help? Well, no. They in turn stilled the American pilots for the entire war, and these would later be held hostage towards the end and used against the president for leverage. And thousands of Cossacks and their families were handed over to certain death, violating the Geneva Treaty, of course, one of the most shameful episodes of the war. The T-34 tank was important, granted, but after 1941, the Germans had taken most of the important industrial sites, and those Stalin had relocated in the east were still setting up. That included the production of steel and aluminum, and for this again they were dependent on the U.S., initially for 5,000 tons of aluminum for the tanks, without which they could not be produced. In October 41, Stalin even said to FDR, "Please send fewer tanks and planes this month. Make room for more aluminum." And speaking of the tanks, we have all seen the battles of Stalingrad, but what is usually missing for those videos and photos are the American and British tanks. Well before the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin had received 1,063 Canadian medium Valentine tanks, 745 Mk2 medium Matildas, 681 American Stuart M3 light tanks, and 676 Stuart medium M3 tanks, and 90 Sherman tanks, and 41 Sherman M2s, and 84 new Matilda tanks, including 20 older Mk7s, and to top it off, 1,100 Bren gun carriers. That's 4,469 tanks and carriers, most of them light and medium. So, I now ask you this. If the 20,000 Russian light and medium tanks Russia had in 1941 on June 22nd were obsolete and outdated, why on earth would America still mass-produce such tanks, and why would Stalin still want them? You let that sink in for a minute, while you ask yourself if Russia could indeed have won the war in the East without American Lend-Lease, including the 1,600 planes and bombers delivered to Russia, also all before Stalingrad. And shall we mention the trucks, without which Russia could not have moved their soldiers, running on rubber wheels, also a commodity which had to be delivered from the U.S. And the British and Canadians had also conducted the disastrous landing at Dieppe. It failed, generally, but it spooked Hitler enough that before Stalingrad he had pulled out 400 German fighters and the SS Leibstandarte from the Eastern Front back to the Western Europe. And at this critical moment as well, certainly that made a difference for the Battle of Stalingrad. Yet Stalin was far from grateful, and FDR did the best impression he could of a doormat to please him. Also the Norton bomb sight, which was one of the most expensive and secret developments of the entire war, second none only to the nuclear bomb. It was readily handed over to the Russians, opposite to the British, who had to wait for over a year, and only when they had exchanged all their secret technology with the US, like sonar and radio tracking technology, which of course they all shared with Stalin, and the icing on the cake, the Russian uniforms. For those, Stalin wanted $7 million worth of gold braids. Speaking of money already, in February 1942, Stalin had received goods for over $1 billion, and FDR wrote him and let him know he had set up yet another credit line for another $1 billion. Do remember the Russians practically never paid for any of this, while the British had to pawn their empire, initially for obsolete destroyers, and put the country in debt for everything else until just a decade ago. And all of this aid, which was handed to Stalin by FDR, was in order to fulfill the Germany First policy, so one would think it could finally stop after the war in Europe had ended and Germany had surrendered. For a brief moment, the new president, Truman, thought so and stopped the shipments, whereafter Stalin had a fit, and Hopkins crawled to Moscow and begged forgiveness and ensured the deliveries would continue, which they did, bringing us to the thousands of tons of war material Stalin then demanded in order to deploy 1.5 million troops to China in order to attack Japan. Needing 2 million pair of boots, 2.7 million tons of material, 870,000 tons of petroleum. So much was sent east it rivaled what had been sent to Russia during the entire war previous to fight Germany. And at a point where one could certainly say Russia did not need it, and most American commanders did not want or need the Russians to interfere in the Pacific. It was quite clear that Stalin wanted to now attack Japan, as he was set on conquest, and he was fully willing to break his treaty with Japan in order to beat the Americans to the territories he wanted. Truman, the new president, one can forgive for not acting faster or grasping what was happening before Stalin rolled out his tanks fueled with American fuel. Truman was still being advised by FDR pro-Soviet advisors, after all. And it was Hopkins who even offered Stalin a trust ship in Korea and Manchuria and the Kuril Islands, none of which Russia owned in any form. But then again, neither was the Baltics, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc. But who was going to advocate for a new war to liberate these eastern countries from the Russians? Those were territories Churchill had tried to make FDR understand They had to, one way or another, save from Stalin's grasp. But it had become quite clear at Yalta that this game was now run by Stalin, with FDR, his faithful lapdog. The two had literally ganged up on Churchill, now left with no cards, and had threatened to walk out of the negotiations, after Stalin had suggested no trials for the Germans, simply shoot 50,000 German officers and politicians. Churchill had gotten up and said he would rather be shot himself than take part in such a criminal endeavor. Roosevelt had then jokingly remarked, how about they only shoot 49,000? It was eventually brushed aside, but the cards was on the table, and the British Prime Minister had none. But at least Churchill had tried. Earlier, he had flown to Moscow to talk to Stalin about the freedom of Poland after the war. Stalin had lied to him, claiming he had no interest in the country, but he still held almost 400,000 Poles in gulags, where these were slowly dying. And when the Polish government in exile's newspaper published an article about what the Russians had done in Katyn, Stalin had complained to Churchill, and had, in the spirit of real-world politics, had to try to silence the Poles in England just to keep Stalin on board. As if anybody asked themselves at this point in 1944, so what if they broke relations? It would be worse for Stalin given everything he was given, but none of the Allied leaders ever considered their leverage. Nothing was demanded of Stalin, and he outplayed them both, and the world was to pay for it for many years after. It makes me wonder what actually happened to Sikorsky's plane. Accident? Well, anyway. So with FDR and his administration's support, the Lend-Lease and Soviet infiltration shows how Stalin coerced and leveraged Western support to build a huge war machine. The $11.3 billion in aid then, over $1 trillion today, included technology later used in the Cold War, suggests Stalin planned beyond mere survival, as the next decades of the Cold War under communism clearly proved. And the Red Army's deployment in June 1941, with 5 million troops and 23,000 tanks concentrated in offensive salients, is consistent with an attack plan of May 15, 1941. Zhukov documented explicitly, calling for a preemptive strike, strengthening this. Examples like the BT-7 tank was designed for European roads, and the million paratroopers further suggests offensive intent. The abandonment of the Stalin Line and complete Molotov Line indicates a lack of defensive preparations. The Russian troops were building roads westwards. They were constructing airfields that was full of planes, not even camouflaged, as they were not expecting an attack. They were preparing for theirs. Thus 1,800 of them could be destroyed on June 22nd alone. They were all positioned for offense, not defense. Upon presentation of this thesis, obviously many historians have made counter-arguments, many of them prominent, so I want to address some of these because I do think events have spoken for themselves. Historians like David Glantz and Gabriel Gorodetsky, both very credible and solid historians, both argue that no Soviet document confirms an attack plan for July 1941. The May 15th plan, 1941, cited by McKeon, could be a contingency on deterrence strategy, not a firm commitment. Glantz notes the Red Army's disorganization with logistical issues and purge-related weaknesses, suggesting that it was unprepared for offense. However, the Red Army had managed heavy logistical lifting, challenging at Khankin Gol, and the extremely heavy winter fighting, and logistics of 1 million men, thousands of tanks and planes in Finland, and both of those were after the purges. So Stalin's army was not incapable by a long shot. And to further document this, let me just go over the Finnish War for a moment. It had often been described as a Soviet failure, given how long relatively small Finnish military held on and the huge losses inflicted on the Russians. The previous purges were credited as a reason for the Russians' lack of success. But this is looking at the Russian war from a Western perspective, giving the wrong idea. First, Stalin had just annexed the Baltic countries under threat of war. He had enjoyed a solid win over the Japanese army, so initially he did expect the Finns not to cause much trouble and just give in. And only when it became clear they were going to stand and fight and had called up 365,000 soldiers did Stalin do as the Russians are prone to do, shrug and call up 1,000,000 more men, and 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces, and 3,000 planes, and said, Vovads, davai. And remember, this was in freezing conditions near Arctic. No other army in the world could have done this under these conditions at this time. And the losses are immaterial because this is sadly Russian life does not matter, and it never really did. Victory matters, and Stalin got what he wanted in the end. Well, actually, he got just short of it. Not because the Finns' resistance, but because he did not want to unite the Allies against him, as I previously mentioned. The Finnish campaign was an amazing piece of logistics. All those assets in that weather, it takes skill and solid commanders. So how can you explain that endeavor if all of their commanders were inept? Of course, good men and commanders were purged, but Stalin had several years to train new ones the way he wanted. And many of those purged were retrieved from the gulags and put back in service. So the purges may not have been as devastating as claimed. And then the claim that there has not been any plans found to the effect of a preemptive attack. Well, has there been papers found of an extreme buildup for defense, seeing the defensive works of the Stalin line having been halted? And it has taken us 80 years to obtain just a few documents from the Russian archives as it is, making it absolutely clear that the Russians could, would, and will hide or destroy any papers if they so wanted with no leaking. So the lack of documents proving a case, which does not fit the Russian narrative, does not convince me. And the May document, to my knowledge, was not known to Glantz before he wrote his book on this, but has only recently come to light. Now, also critics argue that Stalin's cautious foreign policy, including appeasement of Hitler until 1941, reflects a desire to delay the war until 1942-43, when the Red Army would be stronger. But how much stronger would it need to be? They had 23,000 tanks and 16,000 planes. They were far superior in number to the German army already, so why wait? It must have been clear to Stalin that negotiations were now going nowhere, and it was time to go. The Red Army's forward deployment could be interpreted as a show of strength to deter Germany, and not an offensive plan, said historians like Robin Edmonds argued that Stalin's annexations were defensive, aiming to create a buffer against German aggression, not to launch an attack. To that I say, a communist army of over 5 million standing and 14 million in reserve with extensive offensive weapons and a communist killer at the helm was not of a defensive mindset. The very nature of the weapon systems created, or the overriding ideological mindset, was not one of defense either. If Russia wanted a buffer with Germany, she would not have suggested to Hitler that they each take half of Poland, explicitly deleting said buffer. While Sean McKean's portrait of FDR as a naive or pro-Soviet, others argue his priority was defeating Hitler, the immediate threat, public opinion, which saw little difference between Hitler and Stalin until 1941, constrained FDR's aid before Barbarossa. His Germany First strategy reflects military necessity, as the USSR bore 80% of the Wehrmacht's casualties. Now, that is an important point to raise. But at this time, where there were many European countries and many more people worldwide who rightfully saw Stalin and the communists as the greatest threat, while perhaps one could say National Socialism mostly seemed to want to settle scores of World War I, and of course spread their footprints to widen the Lebensraum, shall we say, for the German people and culture. It was never the intention of Hitler to wage war on Britain or America. And remember, it was Britain and France declaring war on Germany. The East, at least, if we date the statement to 1941, Hitler did not want to conquer the world. However, communism did and does still to this day. So for FDR to wholeheartedly side with somebody as murderous as Stalin and give him so much more than he had even ever expected, that goes beyond aiding somebody against an enemy. If defeating Hitler was the overriding priority, why would FDR have to break Britain's back economically and destroy her empire to do so, while at the same time creating a world communist superpower with Stalin at its helm? Hitler could have been defeated without laying the economic and military foundations for 50 years of Cold War dictatorship and subjugation of all Eastern European nations. It is simply inconceivable that FDR and his administration did this only out of the misguided priorities. This must have been deliberate. Say you have two bullies in your school. Both of them regularly beat you up, and one day you see them getting into a fight. Now, why would you aid either one of them? Instead of having them tire themselves out and then call the principal on both of them when they're down, have them kicked out of school. FDR gave Britain just enough to cling on, but Stalin far more than he needed, to the point he would actually sell some of it off to a third party. Why not do it the other way around? If one must help a communist at all, generally McKean is correct in his descriptions of events in his very well-written book. And our own Roger Cook reminded me that the original timeline for Barbarossa was March 31st, 1941, while that was the time Hitler had demanded his military ready to embark on Barbarossa. Now, there are problems with that timeline as a fixed date for an attack, besides, of course, having to go help out the Italians with Greece. The German buildup was not complete, nor had enough munitions been produced. But the bigger problem, and the Wehrmacht knew this, was the weather in the east. It had been extremely wet for the spring, and everything east of the demarcation line was simply mud and rain, something that would continue to be a factor there until late May 1941. And I've never contested Hitler's intention to attack. I am just contending that Stalin wanted to himself. And had Stalin jumped off first, he would have presented himself as a liberator to the Allies, asking for the same amount of aid. And as the Allied armies were not on the continent, he could have taken all of Germany, most of Europe, if not all, as at that time the only military in Europe other than the German one was the Russian one. And had they managed to hack their way through the Germans, the door for a communist takeover of all of Europe would then have been open, making one wonder when the U.S. administration would then have woken up. But that is, of course, hypothetical. There's much more that can be said on this subject, but for now I feel I've hit on some of the key points which have had an impact on the events and into the mindsets of those involved. But as I dive more into this, I will make more videos on this topic, because we need to get the important stuff right, especially since we now are seeing communists on the rise in the West. The Cold War legacy, having spread its seed to our media, our institution of education for decades, is now coming home to roost. And we need to correctly begin to identify who started this, and what it is, and what it has meant to the world. None of this exonerates Adolf Hitler for what he did and caused. But in the past century, communism has destroyed and killed over 100 million people, far more than National Socialism did. And it is the quintessential dictatorship of centralization and mass control and surveillance, with forced compliance and deletion of personal freedom and movement, and of thought and of speech. That is what communism is. And that there are still people educated in the West who believes this is the future must be seen as a prophetic failure of education, of politics, of media, and of historians to properly educate. And my last thought, after knowing what FDR did, makes me wonder about Pearl Harbor. To what extent would this man have gone to get America involved in the European War. Hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you.